So, Professor, first off, I was looking right now. Islam is at 1.9 billion people, and it's the fastest growing religion. Why is
Mhm.
that?
I think the actual reason that it's the fastest growing religion is just purely birth rates.
Okay,
Secondarily, it can include conversions. I think that would be more accurate for Islam's growth in America. But in most places, I think Muslims are just having more kids than everybody else is.
okay. So they're
Uh,
just being born into the religion itself.
yeah, that's it's hard to find data for beyond that. Why is it that it's growing as quickly as it is?
Mm, okay. I think that's not the answer that most people think. I know the first thing that
Yeah,
comes to mind is conversions, right?
yeah. I mean, there's definitely something that's going on in America today. To put in perspective, in a given year here on campus, I might have one, maybe two converts that just that I'm spending any time with. And right now on campus, we have about 40.
Okay.
So the
40
numbers are
converts.
absolutely
Yeah.
converts, and so
Okay.
the numbers are absolutely off the charts. And then I contacted some of my friends who run other Islamic centers, and they're all experiencing the same thing.
Okay.
So it's not as though there's an increase of preaching, but for whatever reason, there's always been an interest in Islam going at least back since 9/11. And so my classes have always been full. People want to learn about Islam and such. But in terms of conversion, I don't know what's causing this change, and no one's been able to figure it out. And this is pre October 7th. After October 7th, there's also been a surge. Uh, but I'm saying for at least the last year and a half, uh, this has been going on. You know.
Interesting. So I think it's fueled mostly by curiosity.
Mhm.
Like kind of goes for how many people are in your class. How was that in the beginning years? There was attendance wise.
Usually, out of 34, 35 students, maybe seven are Muslim. Most are
Okay.
non-Muslim. Most do not identify as Muslim. And your particular class, for example, has a pretty high number of Muslims, but we're still saying maybe 12, out of 34. And most, as you know, on the beginning of the class, I'll have people fill out a simple biodata questionnaire, and I'll ask them very often, why are you taking the class? And this is Catholic school. Sometimes students are saying, I've been learning Catholicism my whole life. I want something different. Or you know I need to fill my theology core requirement. But there are definitely people who are curious, excuse me, who are definitely curious about Islam. That is still probably the highest number of people who are or the most common explanation for why people are taking my class.
It's like where the mind goes. The mind, I guess they're bored with their own religion, for like Catholicism, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that that's often part of it. They're just looking for
Yeah.
something new. Even like with Muslim students, I tell them you have to rediscover your Islam every 7 to 10 years, just because you're 7 to 10 years older. So you look at the world differently. So whatever worked for you when you were 10 is may not work for you when you're 15, but it's definitely not going to work for you when you're 20, and it's definitely not going to work for you when you're 30 and such.
So
And so there's this.
perspective is changing as you grow.
Yeah, I mean, think about how you look at the world today versus how you looked at the world 10 years ago. And that will continue when you yourself reach as we say, inshallah, God willing, when you reach age 30, you will be a lot more comfortable with certain elements of life, and things that cause you anxiety right now may not cause you anxiety then. But there'll be other things that'll be on your mind, because you'll just have a different understanding of what people are like, what you are like, what the world is like. And so for many people, especially in America, that also means reevaluating what's my religious outlook. Um, and universities, probably give or take about a third of the students in a university self-identify as non-NONE. That they might have been raised with something, but right now they're formally, officially unaffiliated. But there seems to be this blip going on this year specifically, where people are getting reinterested in having some sort of system of beliefs and such. And so that could be explaining the surge that is taking place. I mean, it's an astonishing large surge. It's not like going from one or two students to five students. right? Like I said, we're going from 1 or 2 students a year to about 40.
It's a
And
big jump.
it's a fascinating moment.
So I know in most cases there's an element of mental health with religion. It's like, in most examples, you're feeling lost or you don't know what to do. And a lot of people look towards God. Is that something you've seen?
I think that's definitely a big part of it. I mean, life is chaotic, right? And life is going to get more complicated as you get older. And part of the challenge there is to figure out how to navigate it in such a way that you kind of feel like the ground that you're standing on is stable, or that it's not going to give way any moment. And one of the strengths of religion is that it's a well-tread path that people have taken. And that's all the big ancient traditions, right? Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, so forth and so on. So that's one thing. I think another element of that is just an appeal to something traditional. That much of the push in what we call the postmodern era has been to redefine everything. And in the process, this thing that we call tradition has been getting lost and ignored as something old and like a relic, like dinosaurs. But I think especially in your generation, people are looking for something to give them more authentic meaning. Whereas up till that point, your search for meaning was sort of the search for your own authenticity, which I think some people it works for, but a lot of people it doesn't work for, because your own authenticity, you might be confusing it with a desire just to feed your appetites. But with religion, it's always pushing a certain type of selflessness as opposed to a type of selfishness. And just the act of service is, generally speaking, pleasurable, and it's noble. You now think of a whole structure before even speaking about the divine, just how you conduct yourself with people. I think people are searching for that. But then, we do have a natural curiosity about the world beyond. So whenever there's photos from the James Webb telescope or the Hubble telescope that catches our interest, even if we're not science people, trying to comprehend how big, for example, this universe is. And is it possible that we are just meaningless elements of cause and effect in this world? That kind of makes it, it's not a very happy outlook on life. And religion comes along and says, no, you are of as much immense value as the entire universe combined. And then your goal is to live up to your worth. That's a very different outlook. It's basically saying you have this innate dignity and you have this innate value. And so embrace it. Otherwise, the other option is to try to pretend that there's no point, but there's this unmet need inside of you yearning for something, and then you just try to self-medicate, whether it's with some sort of CBD or narcotics or booze or video games. And the end result of that is you just find yourself passing the time, but you don't feel any better. You feel occupied and such, but religion is often pulling you to something bigger.
Right. So it's like, self-worth is a big part of human nature. Mm-hmm. And that kind of plays a big role in this, right?
Yeah. It's, again, like the science era is basically saying that you're fundamentally just part of the chain of cause and effect, which means what? That there's not necessarily a God. And I could dedicate my whole life curing every disease ever made. Or I could dedicate my whole life killing people. Okay. Or I could dedicate my whole life not caring about anything. And all three of us wind up in the same place as fertilizer. And then again, religion's saying there's a much bigger picture here. Related to your own worth, related to the worth of the world. That your existence is not arbitrary. That when we're speaking of religions that focus on a divine, then we're saying that the divine has chosen to create you. That the divine has chosen to give you purpose. and that path is also being promised as a better path of life, a more satisfying path of life. Not necessarily less chaotic. In some cases, yeah, because you'll be better at navigating the highs and lows. Like in class, we spoke about the fact that, every moment of your life is set by the divine, where you'll have some moments that are moments of ease, some moments that are moments of struggle, but it's designed specifically for you, with the divine giving you 100% full attention, right? And so scenario number one, which is basically saying you're just this person in the middle of a dark ocean in the middle of the night. And scenario number two says there's bright light and a raft and a whole bunch of people on the raft along with you.
So a sense of hope.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's a question I think everyone should ask themselves, is how much hope internally do you really have in a given moment? Hope about the moment, hope about existence, hope about your future, hope about the world. I mean, think of all the chaos that's going on in the world, whether we're speaking about Gaza, Central African Republic, things that are happening in India right now, things that are happening even in Mexico right now. And it's easy to not have hope. And a couple days ago, I brought in this physician. His name is Dr. Tahir Ahmad. He's Palestinian, raised in Chicago, and he's an emergency room physician. And so he went to Gaza for a couple of weeks. And so he shared his story, and I said to him, you've witnessed all of these horrendous things, the results of shootings, of bombings, of everything, even famine, and yet you somehow seem to have hope. And he said, he gave some examples. He said, but basically, the people that I saw there who had nothing, literally nothing, did not know if they were going to be alive the next day. They were full of hope. But they weren't just full of hope. They were full of hope and yet full of politeness and compassion. So they would scrounge together whatever little food they could have. They would feed this doctor first. And because he was the guest coming from America. And we're saying for breaking fast, they'd have like grass that they'd mix with a little bit of lemon, and then one bottle of water to share among like 7 people. And he was saying there was one physician there who lived in a different part of Gaza and used to complain about how he had to go from here to here to get to work. And it would take this amount of time. And he had to work like this many hours to be able to put food on his table and such. And for the last 6 months, he's been working with no pay. Can't go anywhere. Working in a hospital that has been partially raided. And then worked in another hospital that was bombed. And he's very grateful just for existence. That existence itself is a very, very sweet, sweet thing. And so, yeah, hope, the doctor was saying that, people there in the middle of the war zone seem to have a lot more hope than we do over here watching it happen.
It puts gratefulness in perspective when things like this happen, whenever there's an unfortunate event, people really see how different their lives are than, others in the world.
Yeah. There's this old TV show, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called The Sopranos, right? Very famous TV show.
Yeah.
And there's this moment where Tony Soprano, who's this mob boss, lives in a luxurious estate, is super powerful as a mob boss. And he's talking to this Eastern European woman, and I forgot what their connection was, but part of her story is that she's missing a leg and is that all kinds of horrible things happen to her. And he says, every time I look at you, you seem like happy and content. But all of us were all like so unhappy. And she said that you Americans all believe you deserve paradise. And so you're always unhappy. Whereas we in the rest of the world, we're ready any moment for our lives to turn into hell. So we're happy with whatever we have. And so gratitude is a big thing. I often encourage my students to spend time with people who have less of the world with you. That'll help temper your own feelings of why me, your own feelings that, the world doesn't care about me. And spend time with people who are more enlightened than you. That'll give you some direction. But gratitude is a very important part of it. Absolutely.
I saw this thing a few years ago. It was like the man in the small car wants what the man in the big car has. The man on the bicycle wants what the man in the car has,
Yeah.
and the man without legs wants what the man on the bike has.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, depends on how you see things.
Totally, exactly. Yeah, it's a very good example.
Yeah, it's amazing. So, different question. So we talked about Islamic law, Sharia in class.
Yeah.
Could you just go into depth on that?
Sure. So Islamic law itself is probably more accurately Islamic ethics, or it exists somewhere between what we speak of as ethics in our society and what we speak of as law in our society. And to help clarify that more, in our modern nation state era, we have laws, right? Laws, and then on top of that, we have regulations. So the room that you're sitting in, the room that I'm sitting in, had to pass a whole bunch of regulations in the construction for it to be allowed to even open up as a building. And so the type of law we have in our era today, we would call it coercive law, where it's imposed upon you right down to the smallest detail. Whether it's a piece of glass or a glass you're going to drink from, it had to pass, certain types of regulations. Or bigger things, related to the Constitution, what's the structure of the society. So Islamic law, Sharia, is semi-fulfilling that role. But more than that, Sharia is referring to the primary sources in Islamic tradition. You have the Quran, which in Muslim tradition is revealed by God to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And then we have, also emanating from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are two bodies. One is the Sunnah, which would be his regular practices, which is sort of like a living interpretation of the Quran. And then that which is compiled in the Hadith literature. So the Hadith are interpretation or records of anything and everything that he did, right? And so that's the source material for Islamic law. And then it becomes the challenge and obligation of every Muslim of every generation to then figure out, how do I take that primary material and make it relevant for my life choices today? And so that active interpretation is based on certain methods of interpretation, and these are the Islamic law schools. So there's the Hanafi law school, the Maliki law school, the Jafari law school, so forth and so on. And they're focused on action, that much of your existence is an existence of action. And so how do you organize action, and how do you figure out from the primary sources what is the most healthy way to live in terms of action? So one element of that most Muslims especially focus on is diet, right? What is healthy in terms of diet? What is unhealthy in terms of diet? Now, scientifically, we tend to focus on the effect on our body, but Islamic law dietary principles also will affect whom you eat with, whom you socialize with will also be affected by diet, right? In America in 2024, you can go to just about any restaurant and eat just about anything. When I was a kid, there was almost no vegetarian options, right? And so if you are a strict vegetarian, that's already going to limit where you're going to eat, who you're going to eat with, right? And so that'd be one element. Or how do you conduct social relationships? How do you conduct finance? And in ways that are healthy. So one of the exercises that we've done in class is look through a passage about loans. And one of the principles in taking out loans is that it should be fair and it should be written so that you can minimize the possibility of doubt or contentions. So Islamic law is basically the pursuit of healthy choices in terms of your actions with the intention of giving you stability in your life. And then the more stability you have in your life, the easier it becomes to turn to God. The less stability you have in your life, the more you're going to be concerned about your own safety, your own stability, and the harder it becomes to turn to God. And so the translation of the word Sharia is the path that leads to relief, or the path that leads to water. And so by giving you stability in life, it's giving you relief. And how does it give you stability in life? By guiding you to what are healthy practices. And what is the source material for that? It's the Islamic primary sources.
Is it safe to assume that the perception or the application of Sharia is changing throughout the eras as time moves on?
Well, I think I want to say yes, both for Muslims and for non-Muslims. For Muslims, there is confusion since the beginning of the nation-state era. The nation-state era is barely like 3 centuries old. And in most parts of the world, it's barely 1 century old. I mean, if you look at a map of the world today, the vast majority of the nation states themselves only can trace themselves maybe back to 1945,
Right.
which is the establishment of the United Nations after World War II. And then, of course, you have some of the older countries like ours, which are older. France is older and such. And so there was a mistaken notion that Islamic law was the law of the land, which then would potentially create a conflict. Do I follow American law? Do I follow Islamic law? But when I mentioned at the beginning, Islamic law is somewhere between between law and ethics. We don't have a concern, okay, do my ethics contradict the law? Because the ethics are focused on guiding me to good, healthy behavior. That's consistent with Islamic law. But some elements of Islamic law are related to crime and punishment. And what that then means is that these are things that do need to be endorsed by the authorities of society. And then to be endorsed by the authorities of society, it means you need to mold society in a particular way. But to be able to mold society in a particular way, it has to be a democratic process. So that's the Muslim mistaken notion. The non-Muslim mistaken notion is often that this is something imposed on people against their will. And so this is why the last point I'm making is that, it has to be done by a democratic process, or we could say a popular movement. It's probably a better way to describe it. Is otherwise, if you're trying to implement Islam top down on a people, it's going to be oppression. Its job is to be the exact opposite of oppression. But this is also the same case that the U.S. is often trying to impose democracy on populations that aren't ready for democracy, and that becomes a type of oppression. And so more and more people are realizing that Islamic law is more akin to what we speak about when we speak about ethics. That's giving principles on how to conduct yourself, and more Muslims are realizing this is guiding me on how to live my life, especially if I'm in a non-Muslim polity like the United States. How do I make healthy choices? What's my guide for making healthy choices and such?
Yeah, I know, especially in America, it's always a fine line between ethical and legal. Well, maybe not a fine line, but there's a big difference in most cases.
Yeah.
So would you say like Sharia is the perfect blend of law and ethics?
Perfect is a very big word. So I could say yeah, but then I wouldn't be able to tell you why. But it is a blend of law and ethics, yes. And so we would often speak of Islam itself as being perfect or being complete. Is probably a better word. And so law, if we remove the law from Sharia, we're not changing that much. If we remove the ethics from Sharia, we are changing a lot. But fundamentally, it's a timeless way to live. So currently our era is the era of nation states. By the time you're my age, who knows what the situation is going to be in America, and who knows, and who knows what the future is of nation states, even let's say 100 years from now. But Sharia will still be consistent. So in that way, whether it's a perfect mix of law and ethics, that is harder for me to answer. But is it a consistent answer to life's questions? Yeah, I'd say absolutely.
It's a timeless relic.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, relic itself is also a big word because that's we would infer that's it's irrelevant, but it's the job of every generation to understand how to understand its relevance. Yeah.
So in class, we talked about suffering in Islam.
Yes.
How is that different from the average notion of suffering or the average connotation of suffering?
So, if we speak in terms of common notions of suffering. One, of course, is why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? Why is this not happening to other people? Or why is it happening to those people who are suffering? Or why is it so bad? Those are some of the big questions. If we contrast philosophically Islam, for example, with Christianity, with Judaism, in Christianity, and I'm being super simplistic, and so you can let your Christian scholars, get on and correct me, that essentially we are here because of original sin, and this world has all kinds of different purposes, but we are in this experience in this world because of original sin, and then that is leading to suffering, and then the redemption from all this is to take Jesus as your Lord and Savior, right? And then in Judaism, we don't use the term original sin, but there is the notion of exile from the divine. And then to remove ourselves from this exile from the divine, we must atone and return back to the divine. And then in Islam, we have been by intention put into this world with the job of being the divine's deputies. And within that, the divine is going to put things in our lives of different, impulses. And those are all invitations to bring us closer to the divine. So when the divine is putting ease in my life, like the comfort that you and I have sitting, you in your place, me in my place, and then we're communicating online, that should be responded with gratitude. And so gratitude, then, God is giving me ease and as an invitation to turn closer to God. And how do I turn closer? With gratitude. Or sometimes God is going to give me struggle. It could be that I'm worrying about how I did on a class. It could be that, I'm worried about whether or not I'm going to be able to meet my expenses. It could be that I'm sick. It could be a loved one has died. It could be the genocide that we're either witnessing or other people are living through. And that is God is also calling you to the divine. And it could be by the way to answer that call is by way of perseverance through whatever hits us. So think back of the comment I made about the doctor witnessing Palestinians right in front of him who were determined to persist, no matter what was happening to them. And so suffering becomes one mode of invitation from the divine, and the way ease is a different mode of invitation from the divine. And then a few other modes. There's essentially 5 total. A third one would be in different times, the divine will impose things upon you, like to make your prayers or to fast. We just had Ramadan, right? Or speak the truth, keep your promises, keep your trusts. So acts of obedience. And then a fourth is sometimes you have to make difficult decisions in life. So I have students right now who are trying to figure out which grad school to go to. They've been accepted into multiple good schools, and now they've got to figure out which way to go to. That's a good problem to have, but still a difficult decision. Or periodically, I'll have people contacting me with end-of-life choices, and so they have a loved one who's on a machine. What do we do now? That's a horribly difficult decision. And so sometimes the divine invites you through requiring you to make these difficult decisions. And then a fifth, so ease, suffering, acts of obedience, or difficult decisions. The fifth is just to seek forgiveness for all the times you didn't turn to the divine for any of the first 4. And so suffering then is one of those forms in which the divine is calling you, but one of multiple forms.
I know it's much easier to turn to God when you're going through disease than when you're going through something that feels good.
So like in this paradigm, there's 2 types of people. One is exactly what you've described, that if you're going through some sort of discomfort, difficulty, struggle, pain, it's easier to turn to God. But then when life is easy, then it's easy to forget God. That's person number 1. Person number 2 is the inverse, that when life is good, they feel like they're getting honored by God. But then when life gets difficult, they feel like they're getting abandoned by God. So the first type of person, it's easy for them to turn to God when life is easy, or I'm saying when life is hard. For the second type of person, it's easy to turn to God when life is easy. And so for the first type of person, they forget God when life is good. And for the second type of person, they feel abandoned by God when life is bad. And so everybody falls into one or the other. And so thus, everybody receives both experiences. So the goal is to turn to God. If my default is to turn to God mainly when I'm in struggle, then I'm being given ease, especially to turn to God in ease as well. And so thus the divine will give you everything.
So out of those two types of people, it's because it's unrealistic for everyone, for 8 billion people to think of God in both scenarios.
Yeah.
But out of those two types of people, which one's better?
I don't know if that one is better or not. I think they're just different types of people. It's kind of asking, like, right, this person likes orange juice, that person likes apple juice, which is better? Or
Yeah.
this person likes hot tea, the other person likes iced tea, or this person likes salty, savory things, that person likes sugary things. Yeah. Different people are constructed different ways. Yeah.
So the ultimate goal is to be thinking of the divine whenever possible or at all times.
That's the goal to get to. We call that Ihsan, when you are in constant communication with the divine. And it takes effort to reach that point. And so you start out at this level we call Islam, where you're basically submitting because you need to submit. You're submitting because you're supposed to submit. And then you reach a level where everything reminds you of God. And then you reach a level where everything is communication with God. Yes. That is the goal. Or I'll even say that's the invitation. If a person is not seeking that, then, it doesn't mean that they're a bad person. It doesn't mean that they're going to go to hell. But the invitation is to go all in your relationship.
Okay. So in Islam, we gave God certain attributes, and one of those attributes was all just.
Yeah.
How does one define all just in that context?
So I would modify it from all just to just. And the difference being that if we say all just, we're saying every moment of existence is just. And it is possible in some cosmic way it is, but then it becomes hard to recognize, because if you're a child whose life is being obliterated in a genocide, where's the justice? If it's all just. But if we speak of God as just, then what we're saying is that this world is more than this worldly life. That after this worldly life, you'll have this experience in death. And then after the experience of death, which is sort of like a dreamlike state, then you'll be facing God for accounting on what is called the Day of Judgment. And on this day of accounting, then the justice of God gets fully manifested, where every balance is balanced. Meaning, if I have done something wrong to you, I'll be paying you back out of the good that I have done. So imagine you could somehow put good into units and bad into units, and each of us on the Day of Judgment, our bank account will be one or the other. And so one element is that any wrong that I've done to you, I will be paying you back with my good works, increasing your good works currency. And if I run out because I've done wrong to so many people, then whoever's left is going to pay me back with their bad. So I'm going to take on the bad of other people. That's one element of the accounting of complete balance. So imagine one person who, wasn't paying attention, and they actually bump into somebody and knock them over. Okay, but for whatever reason, they don't apologize and they're not forgiven. That person's going to have to pay that person back. Now imagine a different scenario. Imagine being the architect of a genocide. They're going to have to pay back every single victim, which includes all the families of all the victims. And it'll be complete justice that way. And then another dimension is your relationship with God. Same thing, because what if you lost everything from a hurricane? There's nobody there to blame, including yourself. Their God will be paying you back, because that's coming directly from God. And so thus God being just, we're saying if you don't include the Day of Judgment, this world is not fair. There will be people in this world who will get away with causing misery to others and never have to pay for it. And there'll be people in this world who will be caused to suffer and are never compensated. But if you include the day of judgment, then we're saying the day of judgment, everything gets completely balanced. Complete, absolute justice. And so when we speak of God as just, we're especially speaking about the day of judgment.
Okay. Is there an element of mercy engrossed in here anywhere?
So the default of all of it is mercy. The first easiest element to identify element of mercy is the fact that God has given you existence. And within existence, God is giving all kinds of layers of mercy. And then when we speak about the day of judgment, the act of justice is an act of mercy. Because God does not owe me existence, and God does not owe me justice. God does not owe me anything. God could have made my life absolutely miserable and then made me live multiple existences of absolute misery. But the promise here in this paradigm is that God is also going to give me full justice, and so that in itself is mercy. But you'll also get the option, or let me rephrase this, that God will exercise the option either to give you justice on the day of judgment, which means you get what you earn, or to give you mercy, which means you get better than what you earn. And so even on the day of judgment, we'll all want the mercy of God. So however much good I've done, I would still prefer the mercy of God, because that'll be... So Islam is all about the mercy of God. And another way to imagine is imagine the flip side. God could always make any of our lives worse. So the act of making my life better than it can be is also an act of mercy.
So even in the afterlife, there is the idea of being thankful for dis-ease that God has given us.
Mm-hmm. If you can reach that point, that's a high spiritual level. As long as it's not delusion. Because I can lie to myself and say, "Oh, I love this difficulty that I'm experiencing right now," and I might know that I'm completely lying to myself. That's delusion. And if you have kids, your kids will see through your delusions, because kids see through their parents, right? As well as parents often see through their kids. And so if I'm claiming something but I don't really believe it, my kids are going to know. And my kids are going to see it in my actions that, yeah, Dad doesn't really believe this. But I can reach a point where I'm recognizing when God gives me struggle, it's making me stronger, and I'm grateful for that. When God gives me struggle, it's wiping away my sins. I'm grateful for that. When God gives me struggle, it's making me appreciate the ease even more. So I'm grateful for that. So you can reach a genuine level of gratitude for when you're hit with struggle, yes. But that's a high spiritual level that takes effort.
How long would it take to get there?
How long really depends upon how fast someone's going to run. And so some people are born with an innate spirituality and will get there faster than others who are just so deep in the world where it's hard for them. So, I'd like to give you a time. So you can do it in about a year and a half. But it might take a little bit longer than that. Yeah.
Awesome. So another thing we touched upon in class is free will versus predestination. Which one is more viable?
Say it again.
Which one is more viable for the average man?
It comes down to, in terms of free will, it comes down to, in predestination, which one is more relevant in a moment. So first, just laying out the groundwork. There are things out in your life that you have no control of. You can't decide when you're going to die. You can't decide when you're going to be born. And in Islamic paradigm, you also can't decide when you're going to die. That's set too. So if I try to take my life and it's not time for me to die, I might be maimed, I might be injured, but I'm not going to die. Or if I'm trying to live a super healthy life to avoid death, if I'm scheduled to die on a certain day, I'm going to die. Might be from a car accident or something. So there are some things that I cannot control. But But the default, if anyone looks at themselves, you obviously have free will, right? I'm holding this little stick, floating it around. That's an act of free will. So your default is still within a range of possibilities. You still have choice. Good. But what if I get hit with a struggle? The struggle was pre-written for me to be hit with. Why is that important to know? So I don't start thinking, if only I did this, if only I did this, if only I did this, I wouldn't have this problem. So I'll give you an example. I was going to meet some students at a restaurant downtown, and I parked my car right in front of the restaurant. It's like the greatest parking space you could have. And the result of parking there, like basically parking there, I decided, all right, let me see if there's a sign that says no parking. And I'm looking everywhere for a few minutes. I don't see a sign that says no parking. I go inside, hang out with student, come out, parking ticket. And there was a no parking sign right in front of where I was parked. And even though I was looking, I couldn't see it anywhere. And so it was destined for me to lose that $50 or $150 that I lost. And so it's as though there is that, I think it was $150, Chicago parking fines. Let's say 50 just to make myself feel better. So that $50 that was sitting in my bank account never belonged to me. It always belonged to the city of Chicago. So the point is that one importance of predestination is to help you cope with struggle. And so a bigger version of this is when you have a loved one who's passed away and you say, if only I did this, if only I did that, if only I tried this, if only I tried that, maybe they'd still be with me. Now it was time for them to go. And so I gave this example of suicide a moment ago. One of my students, he's older, and one of his friends, literally last week, their son took his life. And so the friend of my student asked, could I have done anything? And so the student of mine said, no, it was time for him to go. You may be able to control the how, but when it's time to go, it's time to go. And consider this as a method to help cope with struggle in life. Then also the other side. The other side is, suppose I'm really wealthy. This is to prevent me from getting boastful. Like if I start thinking to myself, I'm really wealthy, look at all these people who are poor, that's because they're lazy. That's wrong. Anybody who's wealthy has had lucky breaks. And the easiest way to imagine this is you have 4 people applying for the exact same job. Let's say you're one of those 4 people. Let's say your credentials are better than the other 3. But the employer happens to receive this other resume in a particular moment, looks at their resume, is satisfied, and then hires that person. And there's moments where you are that person. Or the fact that you might be born in a certain family where you're expected to get an advanced degree. Right? So you're Brown, you're Dacey. It was probably assumed you would get an advanced degree. Right? Probably even before you were born. And now compare that with someone for whom it's not even assumed they're going to get a GED. Right? Like it's considered to be a great accomplishment that they get a GED. What to think of a college degree? What to think of something even higher? And so that would be the privileged side, which is also pre-written. And so on the one hand, it's important to have a notion of things that are outside of your control to help you cope with the struggle of life. And it's important to have the same notion to keep you humble about the privileges that you've been given. But most of life, however, is your choice. So if I've been given privilege, I'm choosing whether to be grateful or whether to be a jerk about it. If I'm being given struggle, I'm choosing whether to persist or whether to fall into self-loathing or self-hate or hatred of the world. And that amount of free choice can empower me to accomplish wonderful things, or it can destroy me, by defeating anything that I ever want to do. Make sense?
Yeah. So there has to be a I don't want to say perfect, but like an apt blend of free will and the idea of predestination.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. Yeah, I think I'm going to use that in future classes. Apt blend. Yeah.
It's like back to your car ticket. So it was your free will to park there, but getting the ticket was written.
It was destiny, especially because I looked for a sign. Now, to make this more interesting, about a year later, different friends, different students, I was meeting them at the same restaurant for like dinner. And I knew I'm not going to park in that one perfect spot. And so I'm driving around the block looking for a parking space, and I find these parking spaces. And there's a sign that says you can park from this time to this time. You can't park from this time to this time. And I keep looking at it. I keep checking my watch to make sure it's the right time, right day. And I keep looking at it and thought, okay, from what I can tell, I have about 3 hours here. And so I park there, go inside, go hang out, have some laughs or whatever, come out, ticket. Again. And then I look at the sign again. It's obvious I wasn't allowed to park there at that time. But for whatever reason, my brain wasn't processing it. And so that $50 or $150 was predestined to go from my bank account to the city of Chicago. I never owned that $50 or $150. And so again, we'd say it's predestined. And maybe the purpose of the destiny was so that I could then use it as a lesson to teach people about predestination.
So now you walk everywhere, right?
Seriously, that's what I should do. But I tell you, literally, I went to a meeting this afternoon out in Evanston, and there I'm staring at the parking signs. And I tell you, I wasn't even sure if I was allowed to park there. And then when I went inside to the meeting, there's someone else. I asked him, how'd you get here? He goes, I drove. I go, did you park on the street? He goes, yeah. I go, I don't know. Are we allowed? He's like, yeah. I said, okay, fine. Still, wasn't totally sure. I came back to my car, no ticket. So yeah, that's affected me quite a bit.
So we discussed the state of Muslims in America. What's the future of Islam globally?
That's a really wonderful question, and there's a couple ways to approach this. The general population of Muslims in the world is young. Remember we said, why is Islam growing so fast? It's because of birth rates, which means you have a lot of young people. And most of these Muslims are growing up in societies where there's not as much opportunity. And that's a big question mark. So if we're looking in places like Pakistan, if we're looking in places like Egypt, these Muslim majority countries do not have solid economies. And then most of these Muslim majority countries are riddled with corruption. So whatever economy, whatever opportunity they could have, it's even hard to get access unless you know someone, unless you bribe someone, right? That's one element of it. Then if you go to places, like Palestine, you have persecution of Muslims. Like India, with the current regime, you're having persecution of Muslims, among others, and then you have that taking place too. And so what needs to happen is that those countries that do have stable, reliable governments, they have to figure out how to expand opportunity for people. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of chaos. In Muslim America, we're at this moment where you have this increasing self-assertion of Muslims in society. And so when I was a kid growing up in America, barely anybody even knew what Islam was. I was a novelty, right? My beliefs were different. I was basically a novelty in class. I was a novelty in terms of my story. And I couldn't have dreamed that many schools in big cities are closed for Eid. Eid being one of the the Muslim holidays. So many of the schools in New York right now, or at this moment, were closed for Eid. I don't think the 10 or 20-year-old version of me could have conceived of something like that. And the Muslims in America have also been getting more self-assertive in terms of politics. And some of this is just a natural growth of the community. We see something similar in the Hindu communities in America as well. And so some of this is just a natural growth. Some of it is also a response to 9/11. That 9/11, after that, the Muslim community went on this huge phase of apologetics, trying to basically say we're not terrorists, we're not violent, we're good people and such. And probably about a decade after 9/11, getting into about 2010, then we started realizing there's some people who are already on our side. There's some people that there's nothing we can say to convince them that we're not monsters. And you have those people in the middle. And the people in the middle will still lean towards wherever their crowd is, which the point I'm making is that realization also then gave a whole lot of us a sense of permission to start identifying ourselves on our own terms. And so now, jump forward a couple of years, we have a couple of people in Congress. We have quite a few people in every elite, field and such, and that'll just keep increasing. And the numbers in terms of Muslims in America and Hindus in America are similar. I'd suggest that the diversity of Muslims in America is a little bit wider. India is obviously a super diverse place, but I'm saying shades of skin and all that stuff. And so that has me curious if we compare the Muslim and Hindu communities 20 years from now, what will be similar, what will be different. But that's what's going on in America, but even in Western countries. So we see similar patterns in Canada, we see similar patterns in England. France is a little bit different because you have this huge amount of people migrating, either as migrants or as refugees. And so there the question is, can the countries figure out how to integrate, all these new arrivals into their societies? But it's overall a big question mark depending on where we are in the world. Of the Muslim countries that are not known to have as much corruption, that are to have more opportunity, one would be like Turkey, which is going through struggles right now, some of the normal struggles of a country. Another would be Malaysia, but a whole lot of these Muslim majority countries have a whole lot of lack of opportunity, lack of stability, and abundance of corruption.
So let's say besides those countries, like Northern Africa, Arabia, India, besides America, I've seen places like Sweden or Norway are also having an uptick of either Muslim converts or Muslim immigration. And it's really affected, I would say, the mindset of the people, especially with Muslim values compared to other values. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that?
So this is a good point, because the basic concern becomes when we're speaking of Muslim values, a lot of times Muslims emigrating are confusing Muslim values with their cultural values. And so, me being Desi culturally, it means I have a preference for certain types of food, and I might use certain types of vocabulary. I might have a preference for, living a certain way, conducting myself in the home a certain way. That's different than Muslim values. Muslim values are basically things like honesty and character and justice. And if the Muslim values of this population in a country means we're calling out corruption in our society, then more power to them. If a Muslim population is saying, well, we like to do things this way, because that's how we do it back home in our home cultures, then depending on the country, either they should consider becoming like the indigenous population, or if they're being welcomed as is, then we say Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, that they should. Then it depends on the country, right? So, let's say if we're speaking of Sweden, for example, if I'm migrating to Sweden as a South Asian and I'm saying I want to be South Asian, and if my society is cool with it, that's fine. If I'm saying I want to be South Asian, which means you need to give me accommodations, then that depends on their cultural legal structure. But if I'm saying I want to be Muslim, aside from the acts of worship, then I should be saying I want honesty, I want transparency, I want the removal of corruption. But I may be seeking accommodations to make my daily prayers. That every country should do for everybody in their religious populations.
So it's a fine line between what the country will allow and not allow, and what they'll accept and what they won't accept.
So, I mean, relate to this also specifically in the case of Europe. So Europe is a very fascinating case study for the simple reason that, okay, these are the modern colonizers, okay? But now birth rates are so low and immigration rates are so high, you have this massive century-long transformation that's taking place all over Europe. So even 10 years ago, but what to think of 40 years ago, could we have imagined that London would have a brown mayor and that England would have a brown prime minister? I mean, when I was younger, that wasn't even a thought. We didn't even think that could be a thing. It wasn't even an ambition. It's like, no, you can't, right? And so I forgot how many mayors there are that are brown in these Muslim in across England, and yeah, that transformation is a fascinating sociological case study. That like the Brits are not having kids, the Swedish are not having kids, the French are not having kids. But you know who is? All these brown people. They're having a whole lot of kids, right?
Yeah. So I think it's a way of them conquering that new nation.
Mm-hmm.
No way.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the intent, but that's what's happening.
But no, yeah.
It's, I mean, especially in England, the South Asians that came in as the common term being unskilled labor, blue collar, that type of thing. And I think what's the name of the mayor? Was it Sadiq Khan or something? His dad's a bus driver, right? The prime minister, I mean, I think he was a super successful investment banker. But I think even in his case, if you go back one or two generations, he's not coming from generational wealth and such. And that is the great thing of many of the Western countries, where you can come in with empty pockets, and of course with a certain amount of luck, a certain amount of fortuitousness, but with a whole lot of hard work, you can accomplish things. Right? That's harder in many other countries in the world, and the transformation is happening. So yeah, it's like an unintended conquering.
So when you have this uptick of immigrants coming into a nation, what does that say for the indigenous people, that population that's already there?
I think they have to figure out how to, make sense of it. If it's an issue that requires them to make sense, I don't think their jobs are being stolen. Yeah. I mean, you will have the politicians who want to exploit the moment and say, look at all these people. They're coming in as criminals. They're coming in full of diseases. They're coming in, with a different religion, and they're taking away everything. And you will, by preaching fear and anger, attract a whole lot of people. But you're not going to be able to sustain it, because your child will be classmates and friends with the kid who is from a different country. And their children will probably marry somebody whose parents or grandparents are from a different country. And so part of the challenge is to embrace the change that's going on. When I was a kid, growing up in south suburbs of Chicago, I was the one Pakistani kid. There was one Indian kid, and we were buddies just because we were both South Asian. I was Muslim, he was Hindu. And then, a few others started showing up. We had some East Asian kids. And again, because we were all different, we had a bond together. That there were things we understood about each other, because there's still some general cultural things that were similar. But still, we were also friends with everybody, And so a set of parents can be super racist, but chances are the kids are not going to follow with the bigotry, and so demographics will cause a change to happen. So if you really like your population to persist, then you got to have a whole lot more kids. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I heard like Muslims are having 7, 8 kids, while
Really?
like Americans have like 2, 3 kids.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. What is the number? I think you
So,
need to have for your population to sustain. I think you have to have 2.1 kids on average per
yeah,
family.
because you're basically replacing the parents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I don't know what the numbers are in terms of American birth rates. I don't know if you know, but in a lot of European places, like 1.69,
Yeah.
1.25. And that's also the fascinating thing about capitalism, that everywhere capitalism goes, it seems to result in the improvement of a whole bunch of stats. Uh, infant mortality goes down, life longevity goes up. Other measurable things related to illness seems to also get tempered, but birth rates go down, which is fascinating because we're basically saying anytime capitalism comes to a location, it's both improving life and also giving its own death sentence, because it won't be sustained because no one's having kids anymore.
It's like a short-lived paradise.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I was listening to a different podcast the other day, Chris Williamson, and he was talking about the birth rate in South Korea and how it's so low that within, I don't know, I think it was 98 to 100 years, more than half the population will be, gone.
Wow. I
And
think
he was
we got to
saying,
send your people, my people there too. Let's take it over too. Yeah.
and he was like, "This is the greatest genocide in a way."
Interesting.
You
That's a
know,
big word. Okay.
yes,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
lowest. It's a low birth rate. It's the most efficient genocide, is what he said. So
Mm-hmm.
it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah. I don't know if that's the most apt word, but the point is still made.
Yes,
It's I'd call it perhaps like a self erasure or something like that. So, yeah.
probably better, more acceptable
Yeah.
term. Yes.
So just make sure you and all of your friends all have like 8 kids, and then make sure each of those kids has about 8 kids. So you got 64 grandkids right there.
Right. Yep.
And yeah, then you can change the name of your town to like Ashwinistan or something. Yeah.
It's all about building the clan up.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know how big your family is, especially for your parents or your grandparents' generation. Your parents are probably like my age. But for example, my father has 13 siblings,
Yeah.
right? My
Right.
mother has 7 siblings. And so when we have a wedding, it's huge. And, like at South Asian Bollywood style weddings, you got to have everyone
Yes.
take their photos. The
Yep.
stage is, I'm thankful these stages have not collapsed with the sheer number of people standing to get a little tiny face in the family photo. So, yeah, we're going to have to invade South Korea then too.
That's definitely a cultural thing because I've been looking at it. So my parents had 2 kids, me and my
Okay,
sibling.
nice.
My grandfather is one of 7,
Yes, there it
and
is.
his father is one of 16.
That's exactly
And
the point. There it is right there. Yeah. So
So
we got to bring it back to your grandfather and your great grandfather's
you gotta bring it. Yes,
practices.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's also a financial aspect in that because thinking about it from the 60s till now, the price of having a 4-person family is kind of so much better back then than it is now. It's
Totally.
an economic thing as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I first really began to discover it, even though this where you're talking about my generation, from of all people, Elizabeth Warren. Before she became a politician, she co-wrote this book called The Two Income Trap. And
Yeah.
the point she's basically making is for everything, and we're actually going to be talking about this in class in the next 2 weeks. The point she's making is that with inflation, salaries have gone up, and the prices of everything have gone up correspondingly. Some things have gone up a little bit more, but other things have gone up less. Whether it's the cost of gas, the cost of milk, the cost of gas has not gone up as much, for example, as the cost of milk has gone up. but everything, shoes, clothes, all that stuff, except for housing. And housing, imagine salaries going up. Let's say, I'm going to throw out a number, let's say 3% a year. Housing seems to go up 5 to 10% a year.
Yeah.
And then what I would also add to that, she may have talked about in the book, but I don't remember, is tuition has gone up even higher, as you know, as a student. And thus, for the home my parents have been living in for the last 30 some years, one of our next door neighbors, when we moved there, he was, I want to say, an assistant manager in the local grocery store. May not have been even an assistant manager, may have just worked full time at the local grocery store. My dad was an engineer, and that person lived in a comparable house. Right. But for someone who is the manager of a grocery store, living in that lifestyle today is very, very difficult. What to think of someone who has a full-time job? If you have a full-time job, it's hard working in a grocery store. It's hard to even sustain, life single or in a single income home. And that is a type of oppression.
Yeah. There was this idea of how inflation is intentional and how it's designed to make birth rates go down and the population go down. But that's a whole different concept. But
that's beyond my knowledge. Yeah. I mean, there's certain price gouging that is absolutely intentional, right? Especially when you include private equity firms and how they play around with stores and businesses and such. But because I even read something recently about like what Walmart did with certain prices, making them skyrocket, making their profits skyrocket. But we also saw price gouging during COVID, and that's just considered to be straight up exploitation. Monopolies are considered to be exploitation. I'm speaking from an Islamic lens, but I mean, this is just, logical that monopolies are considered to be exploitative. And then price gouging in a time of need, like sickness, famine, all that stuff. It's one thing to raise prices for increased profit, but something different to price gouge, like everyone being in cahoots with each other. That's just straight up exploitation, and that will have destructive effects on a society.
So, like, there's an evil intention behind it.
Yeah, I mean, from their vantage point, it's profit motive.
Right.
And they're saying it's a fair game, which it's not. And so, from the advantage of those who are the have-nots, it's absolutely an evil intention.
So I had, one more question. So we slightly touched on 9/11.
Yeah.
And so how I kind of come to the conclusion that such terrorist groups have a different idea of Islam than the general population. You discuss that? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Some things are the same, some things are different. So core beliefs the same. One God.
Right.
The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, being the final prophet, same. Acts of worship are usually the same. But the steps that I can take, to seek social change, then you're going to have some difference. And so the default in Islam will either be clear self-defense or nonviolence. And for many of the terrorist groups, they will argue through weak logic that their terrorist attack is an attack of self-defense, but it's not. And anybody can watch and see that it's not. And then when you throw in theology saying that, all right, if you blow yourself up, you're going to go straight to paradise, you can argue that the terrorists themselves don't believe it, because if I believe that blowing myself up is going to send me to paradise, and paradise is better than anything I can imagine, rather than sending you to do it, I should be the first in line. Right? So Robert Pape, he's a professor at the University of Chicago, political science professor. He tends to be like the global expert on studying suicide terrorism, for example. And he argues pretty effectively that studying every single suicide bombing that we've had, for example, in the 20th century and in the 21st century, the pattern seems to be almost always the same. It's not theologically driven. It is politically driven with the intent of causing a change in a democracy. Usually, it's a fight against occupation. And so, throughout the 20th century, the group that was producing the most suicide bombers were the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. And so they were essentially communist, quasi-Hindu, quasi-Buddhist, but mainly communist, right? And so they were an anti-imperialist force. Usually on the news we hear about, what was taking place in Palestine, or we might hear a little bit about Afghanistan, hear a little bit about Pakistan and such. But the Tamil Tigers were the most prolific. But even Palestine, same thing. That it was to fight off occupation in a democracy. Pakistan is an interesting case because we have suicide bombers in Pakistan, but where's the occupation they're fighting against? And that, I think, is more of a deeper problem of just complete cultural breakdown that is taking place. But still, theology is used as fuel, but you can't say theology is the motivation. And that would be essentially a fundamental difference between the mainstream. And even throughout most of Osama bin Laden's latter post 9/11 life, when the U.S. was chasing after him, if what he represented was mainstream, then he'd be living in mainstream America or mainstream Muslim communities. There's a reason he was living in a cave, or there's a reason he was hiding in a house in Abbottabad in Pakistan and such. That his approach was not considered to be Islam.
Yeah, I know we talk about the religion of peace, like Salam,
Yes.
things like that. It's the complete opposite when you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, there I speak of it also in criticism of occupying powers, that it's your expected blowback.
Yeah.
So even if we're speaking of Hamas, for some, it's a terrorist organization. For others, it is a social service organization with a military wing. But regardless, it's blowback against the occupation, against the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. And Muslim or not, it's the expected cause and effect, whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not.
Interesting.
That if there was Palestinian occupation of, let's say, or let's even reframe it, let's say there's Muslim occupation of some other land, you would have similar blowback.
So I guess it's a certain mindset that people adopt.
It's a sociological condition. It's a sociological reality.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
And even what would it take for a kid to be willing to blow themselves up? It's also a psychological thing. If I told you in the afterlife you're going to have 72 virgins, is that going to convince you to blow yourself up? No. But if you're seeing destruction all over the place of your people, maybe even of your family members, and the trauma itself is going to skew how you're just understanding life, then you might be ripe for a terrorist recruiter to pull you in. And so it's a sociological situation. It's a psychological, situation addressing a very severe breakdown.
So from the point of view of those, yeah, exactly. So from the point of view of those recruiters, they're preying on the psychological state of someone with a weak mind who's willing to do whatever it takes because of whatever they're seeing.
I've worked in de-radicalization cases, and you see this over and over again.
Right.
It's people who are having trouble either coping with the destruction of their population, and or they're just mentally not well, and they're being completely taken advantage of. And I've had multiple cases where it's the same patterns over and over again.
So it's a state of desperation, basically.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's literally a state of psychology of desperation.